Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's great to see all of you. Can you believe we're already halfway through the semester? It's flying by. I am Professor Aditi Mehta from University of Toronto. I'll be your moderator for today. And welcome to our Civic Lab TO curriculum session, Building an Equitable City. So I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So as this meeting is both in person and virtual, and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement may not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. For those of us here in Toronto, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So as I said, today's session is about building an equitable city. Diversity is our strength is Toronto's famous city motto. Approximately 52% of the city's population is a visible minority, and over 50% of residents are immigrants. When I moved to Toronto over 6 years ago, I was super excited to live in a city where so many people looked like me. Additionally, City Council works hard to support and protect Toronto's diverse residents. They have approved strategies and plans that tackle discrimination against equity-seeking groups, including the Poverty Reduction Strategy, Gender Equity Strategy, Accessibility Plan, Confronting Anti-Black Racism, among others. And yet, every day, data, lived experiences, and news headlines remind us of the stark inequalities embedded in our city. So here are some examples across sectors. Women working in the city of Toronto currently earn just over 78 cents on average for every dollar a man makes. At the height of the pandemic in 2020, 21% of reported COVID cases affected Black people, who only make up 9% of the city's overall population. The rate of unaffordable housing in the city has persistently been roughly 10% higher for racialized households compared to white households over the last 15 years. Over 20% of youth in shelters identify as LGBTQ2S, and communities of color and Indigenous populations in Toronto are over-policed. So how can local government critically tackle systemic barriers for all its people, where every individual has the capacity to aspire? As we discuss how to build an equitable city today, we should also consider how we build public consciousness about social injustice and obtain knowledge to make sense of our social realities in the first place. For instance, we know there's a critical gap in data about Toronto's urban Indigenous communities, which is grossly undercounted. Data and news informs policies, plans, and programs, and without the right information, interventions may be flawed. We're very lucky to hear from two expert city practitioners today that are committing to advancing reconciliation and building an equitable city. So to provide a brief description of today's event, the Civic Lab TO curriculum is presented by Strategic Partnerships and the City Manager's Office within the City of Toronto in collaboration with the 8 higher education institutions represented here today. Civic leaders from the city and their higher education institutions are forging a path of partnership and innovation between our organizations. This work includes the development of a new model for the city and academia to collaborate on multi-partner, multidisciplinary research to inform policy and programs. And we are thrilled to be hosting this year's Civic Lab TO curriculum in Council Chamber and today in Committee Room 1. And thank you to all of our partners who have made this possible. So before I pass it on to our guest speakers for today's session, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. So today's session is being recorded and participants are asked not to share any personal information within the meeting. The session will be available on www.civiclabto.ca and made available to your instructor in the near future. If you've joined us in person, welcome, and please note that we ask you to avoid joining the virtual WebEx webinar from this room. The washrooms are located in the hallway behind us, so if you need to use the restroom, you can go at any time and just walk around, and they're behind us. And there also will be time for Q&A at the end of today's event. If you're joining the session virtually and would like to submit a question during the session, please enter it into the Q&A feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if you're joining us here in person, you may speak into the built-in microphones. And to use these mics, press the speaker button to activate the mic. And if you are not sitting near a microphone and you have a question, try to find a microphone so you can come and ask your question and be heard. And then again, when you're done speaking, mute the mic. And we remind you to avoid disclosing any personal notes when you are asking your questions. And lastly, everyone joining us virtually will be manually muted during the event. If you are in council chamber and have joined the WebEx meeting, please mute your device's speakers. Okay, so without further ado, I introduce our speakers. Today we're going to hear from Sam Hill, Training and Development from the Indigenous Affairs Office, and Mark Kim, Manager of Reconciliation, Equity, Learning, People, and Equity. Thank you very much.
Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis Inuit, and Indigenous organizations' relationship with municipal government, City of Toronto. Have this slide deck, please. Next. Deitino herato ne yungari yone ne yongiye waze eto gati deitino herato ne yungari yone eto nyoto ne ogwatnigoha. Segos kanagoa go I igolo hinchigoa. Go hinchigoa. We gather our minds together. Next, please. We gather our minds together and thank the enlightened teachers who have come to help us throughout the ages. When we forgot how to live in harmony, they remind us the way we are instructed to live as people. With one mind, we send greetings and thanks to these caring teachers. Now our minds are one. This is from the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, and we call it the words before all others. Not one of our gatherings or one of our meetings ever get together without these. Sam Hill Yungyats, my name is Sam Hill. Ganye Gehaga, Nawito Wenshote, Mohawk is my nation. Ganye Geha Gadewayansa, Mohawk I am learning. Hold right there, please. Atin hanyo gohya de hanonga sanguaidisun taskinawasi gohya jigoa galohya jigoa laganiha staha akjiha lakjiha yunzatsiha skatanduada no henyo hia skatduaiganigoha. I know more language in Seneca and Cuba than I do in Mohawk, and we are matrilineal, so that's why I say Ganye Geha Gadewayasa. Mohawk I am learning. Next slide, please. A little about me. I have a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary social science and legal studies from the State University of New York at Buffalo. I have one course left to complete my MBA from Canisius College University in Buffalo, New York. The pandemic interrupted, and yes, I do have to finish. It's one elective course. So I am one of 9 children born on the Six Nations of the Grand River First Nation, which is the largest populated First Nation in Canada. I say Ganye Geha Gadewayansa. I'm learning Mohawk because my mother, Lois Geha, and we always add Geha at the end of the word, means they passed on to the spirit world, went to Indian residential school from 6 to 12 years old. Next slide, please. I attend traditional ceremonies on the Seneca Longhouse on Six Nations and learn Mohawk language from a personal speaker. Although my mother went to Indian residential school, she would not let it define her. She exposed us to both Anglican religious beliefs and our traditional teachings and let us decide. She also was because she was taken from her family, we had moved off territory at that time and grew up in the Niagara area. Yet we traveled back there at least, I would say, 3-4 times a month to visit our family and to do our traditional teachings. Even though she went through the trauma of Indian residential school, she believed education was necessary for us. So out of these 9 children, 7 of us have post-secondary education. I have a civil engineer. My younger sister is a lawyer. My one sister is ECE. My one brother has a financial degree. So yeah, there's we marvel that we were able to still look at education as positive, even though it was not for my mother. Next slide, please. In Canada, there are 630 First Nations, 8 government Métis settlements, all in Alberta. We have 4 regions make up Inuit, Nugat. Sorry, I'm gonna have to read this from there. Inuvalio settlement, Northern Northwest Territories, Nunavik, Northern Quebec, and Nunavut, Northern Labrador. In Ontario, there are 133 First Nations. Métis Nation of Ontario identifies 6 historic Métis communities. There are no Inuit settlements identified in Ontario. Next slide, please. 2021 census on housing and Indigenous people, there were 22,925 people living in Toronto who identified with Indigenous identity. That's from the City Planning City of Toronto. Studies using different research methods to identify the city's Indigenous population have yielded results that suggest the census figures may underrepresent the population. For example, the Our Health Counts Toronto study cited a 2016 Indigenous population of Toronto of 34,000 to 69,000. Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, TASC, is a leading nonprofit research and advocacy organization that addresses social determinants of health to improve and enhance socioeconomic prospects and cultural well-being of Indigenous people living in the City of Toronto. Its membership includes 24 Indigenous-led organizations that make up a majority of the designated social service providers for Indigenous people living in Toronto. They estimate the Indigenous population to be around 80,000. The Indigenous Affairs Office, we normally go around 80 to 100,000. And just to give you an idea, governments would go on to First Nations and they would do their health studies, and we would participate, and they would take back the information and not use it or not give it back to them. So there's been many decades where First Nations don't participate in census, whether they're on territory or off. So we can never get a grasp of how many people live here in Toronto who are Indigenous identity. But we have to still look at the numbers. Plus there's fluid, right? People come in, stay with family, or they move out, whatever the case may be. It's a very fluid population. Next slide, please. You may have heard that the City of Toronto is always referred to under the treaty, the dish with one spoon wampum belt. Now, although I have the teachings of it, I'm going to let you listen to someone who has he's more knowledgeable regarding it. I'm going to play the video now.
About harvesting from nature. There was a wampum belt like this one that was made a long time ago to represent our responsibility. In the center here, we have this figure, this purple figure represents a dish. And in a white background represents peace and good times. But in that purple dish is a white rectangle. That actually represents a beaver tail. And we're supposed to eat from this dish, but the important part is that we're supposed to share what's in the dish. So when you go hunting and you take something from nature, you have to give something back. We usually offer tobacco or make some kind of offering to the animal that gave its life for you. You take it back to your village and then you share the meat with your relatives. But it also means that between us and the Anishinaabeg people, we're not going to fight over territory about whose deer is it or who has the right to hunt, because our mother, the earth, provides this great bounty for all of us. So the spoon represents us having the ability and the responsibility to take what we need to feed ourselves, to heal ourselves, but you're always making sure something's in the dish for others. So that's why you don't shoot the first deer that you see. That's why you don't just go in there and kill things and take it all home and just eat it for yourself. So there's some simple rules about the dish. One is you only take what you need. Second, and you don't waste anything that you've taken from the dish. The other is then you share what's there. So you always leave something in the dish for others who are going to follow. And the third part is to keep the dish clean. You don't litter the woods. You don't leave your garbage over. You don't have a messy campsite. You take care of it all. So to show nature, to the earth, the animals, the birds, everything that lives on the earth, show that we care so much that we want this to continue. We have this ancient tradition.
Slides, please. So the picture that we have of the dish with one spoon is the actual wampum belt that we believe was made in this, I think they said it's about 400 years old. So these are the actual wampum belts that I took pictures of when I was at the Great Law recital this past summer. There's another video that I'm going to allow you to look at it. It's a little longer. And this is of the Truro wampum. Now, this is the basics that we use, and this was a wampum belt that was signed with the Dutch. And what it signifies is that the white represents the three principles that we live with: peace, harmony, and good mind, friendship. And the two purple beads remind us that there's going to be two nations that run down a stream, think of them as canoes now, and that each of them are to live in harmony and not disrupt each other. So you'll see a video on there of that, but that's the premise that I'm going to delve into with the City of Toronto's Indigenous Affairs Office. Next slide, please. So how would you describe the Indigenous Affairs Office? We advocate for community. We're guides on the side, thought leaders, change makers and innovators, respectful disruptors, collaborators, amplify culture and truth-telling, amplify voices in spaces not yet decolonized, building circles of allyship and champions. The IOA responsibilities. Toronto has the largest Indigenous population in Ontario and fourth largest in Canada. We strive to enhance the city's relationship with Indigenous communities, working closely with Indigenous partners across the city. One-stop shop for information, advice, considerations, guidance that support the City of Toronto's commitments to Indigenous people. Provide guidance to the Toronto Public Service to ensure that the city programs and policies are responsive to the needs of the diverse Indigenous communities in and around Toronto. Indigenous Affairs Office responsibilities in the Reconciliation Action Plan. So Council ratified the action plan in 2022, and they take parts of it. They have 10 years to implement all the recommendations, and our job is to, one, remind them that these are coming forward and that we need to do them, and two, help community to receive them and actually to promote what are in here. The actions 24 to 28, advocate for Indigenous people within the City of Toronto, increase Indigenous community engagement, enhance communication between Indigenous communities and the city divisions, support capacity within the Toronto Public Service, implement accountability processes. IOA responsibilities, connect community to divisions, sharing information. Our challenge, we challenge divisions to dig deeper, be brave, make truth, justice, and reconciliation an ongoing priority, and will cultivate ideas, hopes, dreams, and actions. IOA is not. The Indigenous Affairs Office is not. Everything is Indigenous. Approvers of your work, gatekeepers, adding a layer of bureaucracy, community. Community is community. We consulted with the IAO. Is not something that we would consider hearing or be happy to hearing from one of the divisions. They need to communicate with community on some of the processes. So I'm going to go to that's a mural of in the city here that Indigenous Affairs helped with making it happen, but community made it happen, and we are just reminders that this needs to be part of the landscape here in Toronto. Dates of significance to Indigenous people. 1831, first Indian residential school opens. War of 1812 divides our territories. 1924, the Canadian government imposes banned election system on First Nations. 1997, the last Indian residential school closes. 2015, Truth and Reconciliation calls to actions are presented. 2023, City of Toronto ratifies and implements recommendations of the Reconciliation Action Plan. And today, Friday, October 11th, 2024, as an Indigenous person, I can wear my traditional clothes, speak my traditional language, use my traditional medicines, and work with like-minded Indigenous people here in the City of Toronto. And that's the impact that reconciliation has had with municipal government. I encourage you all to, wherever you go and whatever you do, to seek out similar policies and procedures. And you know what? They need to be equitable as well. We are the Indigenous people, Ongwahome, what we call it, the original people. However, now you think of the Truro Wampum and the dish with one spoon, we're here to share with others. So equity and people need to come together and be a responsible place at your place of work. And with that, my esteemed colleague, sir, I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much for such an informative presentation, for sharing your language with us, and also for teaching us about the dish with one spoon wampum belt. That was new learning for me, and I'm sure many of the students here today, so thank you. And I will now introduce and pass it on to Mark Kim, Manager of Reconciliation, Equity Learning, People and Equity.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Sam. Every time I listen to Sam, I learn something new, and I've listened to him a lot, but I find something new. So if all of you take away one thing that you share within your social circles, with your family, even as a point of interest, I think it would be time well spent. My name is Mark Kim. I am, I don't know, I guess a first generation immigrant settler to these lands from Korea. My pronouns are he and him. I've been working in the public service for well over 20 years. At the city for about 17 in various capacities. And so I'm happy to join you today. Are there any architects or planning enthusiasts in the room? Okay. Are folks familiar with who designed this building here today? Yeah. Okay, so even though it's not the real reason, I think there is something, there's something nice about people from the public coming into these civic buildings. There's a map, a floor map of this building on that wall there, and folks can look it up online. When you look at City Hall from an aerial view, it's meant to look like an eye with an upper and lower eyelid, and the center, what people call the saucer, where we're in, being the pupil. And it's the eye of government. And so it's up to you to interpret whether that means a nefarious government who oversees and watches you, or whether it's meant to say government should be transparent and you have every right to keep your eye on how government works for you. And so in that vein, I welcome all of you to City Hall today, and I'm so glad you could be here. And I'm really excited by the prospect that there is an entire generation of people who are interested enough to take a local government's course, an urban planning, urban design course, in hopes that you somehow leverage that to ultimately become a city builder yourself. And in so doing, understanding what reconciliation means and understanding what equity means will be key, regardless of what role you might take in government. Let's go to the next slide. Yes, there we go. So for today, I thought what might be helpful is first, before we talk about building an equitable city, let's just make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So let's talk about what equity means and what it doesn't mean. Then we can talk about how the city tries to approach equity-focused work. And then we'll use a specific example of the equity responsive budgeting process that happens at the city as a way to stitch all those ideas together. Next slide, please. So understanding concepts of equity, I get a lot of unsolicited LinkedIn ads to be an equity manager at Scotiabank and other financial institutions. And of course, that's not what we're talking about here today. We're talking about, well, let's start first with what we're not talking about. Equity and reconciliation are not the same thing. Sam's alluded to this, but let me make a very clear point so that in your travels, as you talk to people, that you're mindful of the language you use, depending on who you're speaking with. Indigenous peoples have a unique place, history, and rights in Canada as set apart from others, and that needs to be respected. Reconciliation is an attempt to redress past wrongs, not by individuals, but by government, institutions, and policies. And so when we talk about reconciliation, we're not talking about an equity initiative. We're talking about a standalone thing. Reconciliation is separate from equity. It recognizes, respects, and promotes the unique rights and needs of Indigenous peoples. It is premised on truth, it is premised on justice, and it is premised on recognizing and respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis rights to self-determination. However, approaching city building through an inclusive lens supports both equity and reconciliation. Next slide, please. So as Aditi alluded to in her opening remarks, the City of Toronto is one of the most diverse cities in the world. Like, just look around this room. If we're a microcosm of the broader city, there is diversity, not just in terms of what people look like and how they dress, but if we could anonymously take a survey, we would probably find significant diversity in terms of income levels, education levels of your parents and your grandparents, whether you have a two-parent family household or you have a family structure that's not premised on two parents, whether you have different caregiver, whether you have disabilities that are visible or not visible, there is a great swath of diversity in the city. It allows us to be vibrant, and in all other fields of study, including science, diversity actually is a strength. It's not just the motto. In ecology, in environmental biology, diversity allows for life to really flourish. And I take that to heart in applying and thinking about diversity at the city. It is one of the most diverse cities of the world. It continues to be built and shaped by the experiences and contributions of Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities. And yet these same communities continue to face barriers. And so for those who are listening to these words thinking, but it's better now than before, these are two independent statements. One has no bearing on the other. If we look at the status today, there are still barriers that people face. You may have experienced them. You may have family that's experienced them. Those are your lived experiences that there's a ring of truth to this. And so I start there to say reconciliation and equity are not the same. Equity is important in a place like Toronto where we have so many communities and experiences that make up our city. Next slide, please. But who are we talking about? So just so we don't treat, the phrase Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities, who are we talking about? Well, we are talking about Indigenous communities. And even that term, I suggest caution. There are reasons you might use that term, But the downside and the risk of using that term is you are homogenizing distinct communities. Even within First Nations, you have different First Nations. Sam mentioned the number of First Nations in Ontario alone, and they all do not think the same, behave the same, and necessarily value the same or have the same challenges in front of them. But we are talking about Indigenous communities. We are talking about women. We are talking about Black communities. We are talking about racialized communities, the 2S LGBTQ plus communities. We take care to say communities because they're not a monolith. The fact that you might be gay doesn't mean you have the same experience as someone who is trans. Persons with low income, persons with disabilities, youth facing barriers, seniors facing barriers, immigrants, refugees, newcomers to the city who are undocumented. These are the people that we try to think of explicitly to inform our work and how we craft policies and programs at the city. But we know that people have intersecting identities. Okay? So just so that that doesn't sound like gobbledygook, we know that people aren't one thing. You are not just an Indigenous man. You might be an Indigenous man with a disability. You might not just be a Black woman. You might be a Black woman with low income and a senior. The challenges and the barriers that these communities face become compounding when you have multiple social identities that intersect and make it that much more challenging. So it is a danger point to say, I've spoken with Black people and I understand them. No, you don't. You understand maybe something of who you spoke with. And so I try to be careful about overgeneralizing here, and it's really important to me to impress upon you the nuance that's involved in the work. For the sake of presentations like this, sometimes we have to be a bit more blunt and general, I appreciate. But I think the key takeaway is don't overgeneralize when you are engaging in this type of work. Next slide, please. These are just things that further reinforce what Aditi led off today's session with. We know that Black communities are overpoliced. The data shows that. We know that people with disabilities are more likely to experience food insecurity. They're more likely to experience precarious work. We know that 2S LGBTQ communities and youth face significant housing-related barriers in Toronto that's disproportionate to their population makeup. We know Indigenous people constitute notwithstanding Sam's mention earlier that population demographic data by Indigenous people is less than reliable, whatever reliable information that pegs their population levels at 15%, those are not commensurate with their representation within the homeless shelter system. These are issues. These aren't issues because one individual at an individual level made a poor decision. That narrative is incorrect. There are certain things that happen in society and certain structures that make it incredibly challenging for people to find success in life. Next slide, please. And so that brings up the question of fairness. I have a conversation about fairness with my kids all the time. I forgot to mention I'm a father of three, 17, 14, and 10. And my 10-year-old has an overdeveloped sense of fairness. He looks for fairness all the time. My 10-year-old criticizes me when I lecture one of my daughters to say, was that fair? Could you have been kinder? And of course the answer is yes, and I resent him for making me look at myself. But I think the point here is inherently, people that I have met in my life have a sense of fairness. They may not be able to articulate it, they might not be able to put parameters and how can I measure the level of fairness here, but intuitively you understand when something seems fair and unfair. And so we have different words for that. In the past, people use words like equality. That's what is fair. But then people realize equality assumes that you all started from the same place with access to the same resources, with access to the same education. And so equality was a no-brainer. If that assumption held true, then yes, equality, I guess that's an aspiration worth striving for. But when people understand that those base assumptions were incorrect, equality became a model of thinking that didn't reflect what was happening in the real world. And so the notion of equity starts to come up. Equity is based on the realization that not all people start their life in the same place with the same chances, the same opportunities. Equity wants to understand, acknowledge, and remove barriers that prevent the participation of people, of individuals, of groups, of communities, so that they can get fair treatment, fair access, fair opportunities, that they can make something of their life and achieve success, whatever that might mean. And from that perspective, I don't know, I haven't met many people who might disagree with that sentiment. Next slide, please. So what does that mean in terms of equity at the city? So we started out at a conceptual level. Next slide, please. Equity at the city can be framed in a multitude of ways, and these are all framing. These are all framing. You can frame things in many, many different ways, but for the sake of today's conversation, this is one way to frame it. And it's premised in recognizing that the city is both a service provider of local government services and goods. Okay? The city offers rec programs. The city offers childcare programs. The city offers snow clearing. The city offers a suite of services to the public, but the city is also an employer. So when we talk of equity, it would be disingenuous to say, let's be equitable in terms of how we provide service to the public, but let's be inequitable as an employer in terms of creating opportunities for advancement and success of diverse populations. Doesn't make sense. So at the city, we pursue equity on both fronts, service equity and workforce equity. Next slide, please. This infographic illustrates what we call the equity and reconciliation infrastructure. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a way to try and convey that there are various approaches, tools, resources that all combine to ensure that equity is informing the work of all of our colleagues. The city has 44 divisions, has over 35,000 employees. It is a large organization. The city of Toronto is larger than many provincial governments, both by the number of employees and by the budget that we yield. And so with an organization this complex and this large, you cannot solely rely on people's good graces and education because people come and go. As an institution, we need to ensure that structurally equity is built into the pillars and the DNA of this organization. But how do we do that? Well, we do it through various tools, some that we cluster under strategies, action plans, some that we cluster under supporting units and teams that provide direct support to allow our colleagues to do that work, some that are clustered under tools, resources, and training, some that are clustered under data gathering, data governance, some under policies and processes, and some under advisory bodies. The cumulative effect of all of this is that whenever the city wants to review or develop a new policy, a new program offering, a new strategy, that there are mechanisms in place that force the conversation or the analysis to take place, an equity impact assessment, an equity analysis. You might have a great idea. Now, take that seed of an idea and run it through an equity analysis. How will your idea and initiative affect or disaffect certain communities in the city? And if you hadn't thought about it, this is the opportunity to do so. It doesn't mean your idea has to die, but it means that you have a certain amount of due diligence as a public servant to do the exercise because this is the public we serve. We cannot create things just for ourselves. We create it for the entirety of the city. Next slide, please. So in order to situate that work, there are several teams at the city. Well, let me take a step back. Everybody at the city, every staff member in every division is responsible for equity. It is not a separate thing. It is not an add-on piece. It cannot be. However, there are certain teams within the city that have a large portfolio of work that advances equity. Under the People and Equity Division, the Equity and Human Rights section, which is what I'm a part of, we have the units that are posted in front of you. There is a separate equity team. There's an accessibility team. There's a data for equity team. There's a gender equity team. There's a human rights office. There's a reconciliation equity learning team that I manage, and there is a workforce equity unit team. But we work in collaboration and partnership with a couple of key organizational partners. Sam from the IAO is going to be one of them, but our colleagues within Social Development Finance Administration are the other. So if you turn your mind back to 2 or 3 slides ago, where we framed this as there are service equity provisions and there are workforce equity provisions, the work that People in Equity do straddle both. The work that Social Development and Finance Administration do tends to focus on the service equity because a lot of their programs and strategies are public facing. They are things like the poverty reduction plan. There's an office for that. There's a Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit who has ownership of the city's Confronting Anti-Black Racism strategy. And so these are key equity partners at the city, but equity has to be something that all divisions adopt and undertake. Next slide, please. So in terms of, I won't speak for other divisions and we don't have time, but how does my team work towards advancing equity? We focus on 4 specific types of values and support that we can provide to the organization. And we do that in hopes of building out the capacity of the broader organization, this complex organization, to embed equity by deliberately and intentionally identifying and removing barriers to access, or better yet, increasing access and opportunities, and ensuring the fair distribution of services in the way the city does its work. So there's a certain amount of capacity building that happens. We also work to promote accountability. Part of that accountability is trying to drive common purpose. If we are all doing things in different ways, in different direction, it doesn't yield as large of an impact as if we are all doing the same thing in the same direction. We also are involved in compliance efforts. These are not nice to have, folks. There is a thing called the Human Rights Code in Ontario. There is a thing called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act in Ontario. Within a legislative context, the Ontario Human Rights Code has primacy and supremacy over all other laws in Ontario. So the Ontario Human Rights Code provides protections against discrimination for people based on your background and in prohibited areas of life. Cannot be discriminated in when you look for housing. You cannot be discriminated in the workplace. And it is based on those same identities that we've been discussing today. So there are legal aspects to this. But for a complex society to achieve equity in any meaningful way, there's probably a balance of both. You need carrots, you need sticks. So there is a stick on the books. It's the Human Rights Code, and there's a tribunal where people, individuals, groups, organizations can make a human rights complaints. But before we do that, because that is a terrible way to go, it exhausts resources. It forces people to experience further challenges before they get redressed. Before you get to that point, it is better for us as a city to be proactive in how we do things, to identify those barriers so they don't even make it to the front door, that we design programs that are inclusive in nature, and that the accommodations people might require are very few and far in between. And that's the goal. I don't think it's difficult to understand because that's probably how you would want to manage your life. Have as few problems as possible. And finally, our team helps to administer data and data governance work by leveraging data and insights to help City Council make evidence-informed decisions. Next slide, please. This is going to be very hard to see, folks, but this is a sampling of the types of projects that the various teams in the Equity and Human Rights section undertake on an annual basis and things that are coming up. So while I speak at high levels, there are detailed work that needs to happen, both at a strategic level, at an operational level, at a design level. And so having integration and the ability to approach these issues in a consistent manner at the city is incredibly important. Next slide, please. So that was a lot of information to digest, I think, at first blush, especially if you haven't really delved into this sort of information before. So thanks for staying with me. I think everyone is still with me. And so let's stitch all of that up, okay? Because a lot of it might just sound like motherhood statements. Okay, so let's have an example of how all of these things kind of coalesce around a single example, the city's equity responsive budgeting. Next slide, please. So the equity responsive budgeting is intended to support informed decision-making and budget planning that responds to the unique barriers and experiences of Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities. It helps decision makers see the alignments between the budget and city strategies, but also helps people understand what the equity impacts are going to be around budget and resource allocation decisions. It wasn't so far ago where whenever there is a government budget discussion or debate, that it's really about dollars and our dollars being used wisely. That's how often the narrative was framed. And if it's not being used wisely, how much do we need to increase taxes in order to make this happen? But what was missing from the conversation is what is the intended or anticipated impacts on Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities of these very significant decisions that are being made? For a lot of people, budgets are very boring. But if you work in policy or intend to work in government or in policy, it's of critical importance because this is how governments decide what is important, where they want to put those dollars. And it seems that it is an inequitable way to make that decision if you don't have insight into how this might play out in various communities and neighborhoods across the city. So the equity responsive budgeting then is meant in part to help address that or help better inform elected officials when they are debating and deciding on the budget. The implementation of this process needs to be a collaborative one because of the complexity of the nature of this organization. So part of this process starts with what we call engagement and training. We engage senior leaders, we engage elected officials to let them know this is what's going to be involved. And this is how we're going to reach out to your teams. And then we're going to train your teams on what you need to do to conduct a useful equity impact analysis around your proposed budgets and how to frame and come up with equity impact statements that will accompany your budget proposals. At the same time, and this is a timely example, because the mayor launched the public consultation for the 2025 budget last week. At the same time, we don't rely solely on civil servants and city staff to decide what the impacts could be or might be. That's your best effort as professional civil servants. But it is also important, as Sam said, to talk to community, to let people who are experiencing these service deficiencies or challenges or lacking resources in their particular communities to say what is what. And so those public engagement inputs are also obtained. Last year, for the 2024 budget, I believe, there were about 10,802 surveys that were completed and received in terms of formal inputs from the public. But in addition to that, we also engage grassroots community organizations. Not everyone and all communities will necessarily be plugged in and be involved in the public consultation process of the budget. Part of it might be that maybe we don't engage the public in a really good way. If there's an online portal, folks who aren't comfortable with technology or don't have access to technologies aren't going to do it that way. If most of our consultations are held in English, people whose first language isn't English won't necessarily feel comfortable in coming. If we don't account for people who are neurodivergent or people with hearing disabilities, we're not effectively communicating and creating opportunities for them to submit their inputs into the budget process. But that said, public engagement is an important and critical piece. Once those processes are underway, then we look at the equity impact assessments. And our team provides supports to our colleagues. There are 2 ERB leads in every division who have responsibility for assessing and analyzing their budget proposals through an equity lens. And our team provides those leads with support. But at some point, we need to look at them and collate them and ultimately prepare an equity responsive budgeting briefing note for council and for those folks who are looking at and making budgeting decisions. Next slide, please. These are hard to see, but these are some of what the end products look like. The briefing note, if all of this is public information, folks. So if you just go to the City of Toronto's website and go to the clerk's portal, part of transparency in government means rules around when you can discuss these things in committee rooms and at council. And anything that happens at committee and council that isn't a private or a confidential matter, all of it is documented in council decisions, and all the staff reports that go forward to council, they're all publicly available. Okay. It would be more fun for me to say, don't tell anyone, I'm giving you a sneak peek into the inner workings of government, but this is all transparent stuff. And so some of these, if you take a look, and for folks, just out of curiosity, just take a look to see how all of that work gets translated. For some, it will be underwhelming. You will see that beside a budget proposal are 2 words: positive impact or medium impact. Or in a more detailed description of that budget proposal, you will find the equity impact statement, where the civil servants who are responsible for creating or submitting that budget proposal item have done their best to identify what are the impacts that this will have on the equity-deserving communities that we've identified. So I'll pause there. I think that really brings me to the end in terms of how to take some of the higher conversation concepts into a specific example, and I'll turn it back to Aditi.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for so clearly outlining these foundational concepts for us around reconciliation, equity, equality, intersectionality, and showing how those frameworks are really implemented in your office and the work that you do. So we have a lot of time for questions, which is excellent, and I know people have a lot of questions for you both. I'm going to take advantage moderator and ask the first question. So Sam, you spoke a little bit about the challenges of collecting data about Indigenous communities. And Mark, you talked about how data is a really important tool in your office. So I was wondering if you both could talk about how the city collects reliable data about equity-seeking communities to inform policy and interventions.
I can start. So at a broad level, data and data-driven decision-making is important. It's important in many facets of life, and it's definitely important when elected officials are trying to make the best decisions for the way this city grows. The city does have a robust set of data, and there's an open data portal that you can go to find out some baseline information, both about hard services, soft services, and general demographic data based on census. StatsCan census data. So if you want to understand, hey, in a given neighborhood or a community, what's the median income? What's the household composition? So that you can understand how might this inform policymaking, that exists, and that's all openly available. Where our benefit to the city comes in place is focusing on, for the lack of a better term, diversity data. There isn't a large collection of that other than if the StatsCan's census data, because it's voluntary, if you elect to identify yourself in various ways, then some subsets of data are available that the city will utilize. But sometimes geographically, it's too broad. It might account for the census metropolitan area, but it doesn't account for a particular community. And so we have staff who try to do that. We have staff who build diversity data guidelines so that as the city looks to collect more data, that we're doing it in a consistent way, that the definitions are consistent so that we collect data that might be shareable, that might allow for a broader analysis, as opposed to someone saying, are you this and that? No, we have an entire guidance document if you are interested. When it comes to, and I can let Sam speak to this as well, when it comes to Indigenous data, there are other sets of considerations we have to factor in. Sam made some general allusions in the past based on the history of how First Nations and by extension Inuit Métis were engaged, where information was taken, never shared back. There is a notion of data governance and what that means. And it is something where a division within the city, Toronto Shelter Services, did some work several years ago to at least get that conversation going. The City of Toronto, as an order of government, we are compelled to comply with all provincial legislation. And part of those legislations have duties in terms of how we collect, maintain, and store records. It's another way to say data points. And so there are those considerations, and there are considerations around how to build relationships with our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And so there is right now, my team is working on a First Nations, Inuit, Métis data governance framework. That work is ongoing, and hopefully it will become public in the coming year or so, but it requires a lot of consultation. It is an interesting question. When you talk about certain social services, within my lifetime, the prevailing argument was when you collect too much data upfront, it might be a barrier to accessing that service. People might have all sorts of reasons why they don't want to divulge a lot of information about you. If you are operating a shelter and someone's coming in out of the cold, the last thing they probably want to do is sit down over a 20-minute intake about your level of income, about how long you've been underhoused or living rough. And so from a service provision perspective, it wasn't so long ago where people said, these are nice to haves, but they get in the way of providing service to people who immediately need access to service. But there's been a shift in conversation to say, that's fair and that's true. And maybe that conversation doesn't happen at a specific point in time, but without good information, how are we meant to identify where we are very poor at delivering service? And how are we meant to understand how we can begin to tackle what seems like intractable issues in the media? And so data is a key part of that. So the city does value data and evidence decision-based making. But as we know, there are challenges to obtaining this type of information. As a side note, I would caution everybody in the course of your work where you're looking at population data and diversity data of overreaching in your analysis. There are reasons, especially with surveys, why some people and communities might be predisposed to answering and why others may not. And there are good reasons, good historical reasons for that. When the pandemic happened, there was an absence of data. Toronto Public Health, managing an emerging global pandemic, did an amazing job, and an amazing job of collecting data while delivering public health services. But their data also fell short and did not include certain categories. And it provided an ignorant decision-making vacuum for us in terms of how we can reach out to particular communities. And so to the city's credit, they pivoted quickly to say we need data where we don't have them. So it is an example of where data isn't just numbers on a page on a spreadsheet, but it informs and drives policy and resource decisions. And the better you are at collecting that data, of analyzing that data, not to fit your narrative, but to truly try to understand it. Why is this weird thing happening? Well, it's because the question we asked was so broad. And there are actually 4 communities who are answering under one category. Those are important. With that, I'll turn it over to Sam for any thoughts.
Thank you for that, Mark. Actually, for mine, I may have to put on my Gusto and give the indigenous perspective where we are not that interested or find data as important when we go in for services. However, I then have to take that off and say, but as a City of Toronto resident and encourage programs and services to better serve Indigenous people, the Indigenous organizations of the city do need that data. And we believe that it's probably best that they collect it and provide it back to us. And in that case, we have to look to community for a lot of the information that we need to better service or better prop up our programs or to refine them. There is there's a and I don't mean to, I guess, promote another institute or anything, but OCAP training, which is Ownership, Control, Access, and Protection. Years ago, one of the health indigenous organizations got together and said, we need to create this training for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous who are accessing our community information and not providing it back for us. So they did this training called OCAP, which will help anyone going in to get research or data information. So I look forward to anyone requesting that information, and I can give that to you. And that's a start to help you identify why Indigenous communities are so fearful of providing that information, contrary how important it is for that community. So they're in a little bit of a decision-making dilemma, as I am every day as an Indigenous person working in a municipal government that's supposed to help Indigenous communities, but sometimes I see them not being so justful in that. So daily I'm tossed back and forth, and I use my teachings and the guidance from my leaders to help me with this, and that's why I'm still here.
Thanks so much for those very thoughtful answers that really also point to the nuance in the work that you both do. I will open it up to the class for questions. I see a hand here, yes, and remember to turn on your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so you talk a lot about like recommendations and policy and all that, but I wanted to know, what is do you have a specific mechanism by which you keep the city accountable, and avoiding into the trap of, oh, we consulted with the IAO or we consulted with the equity office or whatever. So how do you go beyond informing decision making, especially when the council and mayors and all that are elected officials who are ultimately they're responsible to the people, but not necessarily your office?
Yeah, it's a very, very good and insightful question. And it's particularly challenging when you have, again, a workforce of 35,000 in 44 divisions who do very different types of work and provide very different services for the city. So where we try to build that scaffolding is in a couple of ways. One is that there are mandatory trainings that all public employees have to take. Doesn't really matter what position you hold, from intake workers and kiosk staff to the city manager. And those trainings focus on fundamentals of human rights. So understanding what the law says about prohibited grounds and protected social status. There's accessibility training that is mandatory. My team administers what we call a Toronto for All learning program that focuses on other equity-focused modules. But those are all to help people, because the city attracts so many people from different walks of life into its employment. It helps to establish organizational norms and our base expectations. But then we need tools to help people do their work. And so our team also puts out what's called an equity lens tool. It is a web-based application. It's not publicly available. It's an internal application where if staff are coming to council for any decision, so any policy decision, any resourcing decision, any budget decision, any approvals, as part of that, they now must formally include an equity impact statement about what they're bringing forward to elected officials to decide. In order to create that statement, they have to use this web application to do an analysis, and it will walk folks through. What are you proposing here? Is this a plan? Is this a strategy? Is this a policy? Is it a program? When you have devised this, what are the anticipatable negative impacts on the following communities? And if you don't know enough about these communities, here are some quick resources about these various communities that you should understand and how they are represented in the City of Toronto. If your policy plan or program or service design negatively impacts these folks, what are you going to do to mitigate that? If you are not able to mitigate that, what is the anticipated impact, equity impact on this, high, medium, low? So there are tools that are meant to help guide civil servants to execute their duties as civil servants, but with the community's interests firmly centered. Okay? That's not always how it starts, but at some point they will come across the equity lens tool, or they should.
Any other questions? I see a hand here.
A question to Sam. 2 weeks ago when we were here, we were not allowed. There was a big ceremony and an opening of something. Could you tell us about that and how students might be able to access it or professors access it? All over the place. And
Thank you for that. I think I'll go first because yours is going to take a little longer. Thank you for that. The observation that you had was the Spirit Garden, which was spearheaded and has been, I think, 7 to 9 year development with the Toronto Council Fire Native Cultural Center. They are the ones who have spearheaded it, advocated from the city to put the funds in to promote it, and it is a honoring grounds, so to speak, for the indigenous, the residential school survivors. It also shows all of the placemakers there that of all the Indian residential schools in Ontario that affected our families. It also, gives representation of the First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit there. It is accessible to the public. However, I really would advise you to contact the Cultural Center, the Cultural Fire, on their website and ask for permission to go in there. I know they're setting up programming for it. The initiative was in partnership with the City of Toronto, the Economic Development and Culture Division. So they got it already on time for the reconciliation Day of Reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation recognition that we had on last weekend. So I really do think you need to connect with Cultural Fire for any details on that, okay? And I'll leave it to Mr. To answer Mr. the woke questions. Sorry, Tim.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Joe. wasn't one I teed up for myself. I'll answer it, but I don't think it's going to be a satisfying answer. To some degree, and this is a personal response, by the way, let me just start there and say this is not a City of Toronto response, but from my personal perspective, woke and anti-woke serves as something of a distraction. I think what I take away from it is inherently there's going to be politics involved. Anytime people feel that they're either being left behind or being treated unfairly or that others are getting preferential treatment, if that is the base feeling, there's often going to be an interaction. Now, when historically oppressed folks have made those arguments, and where people, reasonable people, with a balanced mindset, look at the historical oppression and agree, that is unjust. Maybe at that time, it seemed like it wasn't unjust, but it is unjust. Then there isn't conversation of whether what's being proposed for women's rights, for the ability for undocumented residents to access city service, there isn't a debate about whether it's woke or unwoke. There's a discussion about what is the presenting need and how can we meet those needs for Torontonians. It does highlight again, though, it can be a politicized area of conversation. I think more concerning for me are, particularly within a US context, after a lot of the disturbing events that arose during the pandemic, there were many US corporations that quickly adopted DEI initiatives. And they might range from training, they might range from hiring more diverse workforce, and there is an increasing number of those same companies that are now abandoning those initiatives. It's not that I have a position on that, but my concern is that those weren't genuine attempts to embed and introduce equity into those areas. It feels more like a fashionable thing, or when it no longer serves your need, you can drop. But there aren't many of us who have that choice. There aren't many people who live this life in this world where you can decide equity isn't important anymore, because it affects us daily. Can I just ask the number of people here, when you go out to eat dinner with your friends at a restaurant, how many call the restaurant ahead of time to ask where their bathrooms are? Yeah, you generally don't. But if you use a mobility device, that's the first thing you need to know. It's a dignity issue. So there are people who cannot escape this, and it's those people's whose interests that I'm primarily interested in. Conversations about woke, not woke, I think it's distraction. It gets good social media play, but I think as professional civil servants, it reminds us of how politicized things can be. It reminds us to be responsible about how we're approaching these things. It reminds us to account for what the pushback and challenges and concerns about specific proposals are going to be. But that has nothing to do with being fearful of being called anti-woke. That has everything to do with being a professional civil servant and executing your duties professionally. So I don't think it answered your question, and I apologize for it, but I think it's an opportunity to let folks know, you know, equity work may not be for the faint of heart, but it is terribly rewarding. Your legacy may not be something you see in your lifetime, but your legacy will be there. And so again, for anyone who's interested in civil service, I'm a big fan. I'll talk to you anytime, any day to help you come in. A strong civil service is often needed, in my opinion, because over history, we've seen that just market demand can't address all social needs. We need intelligent people. We need people who value what the city values in order to sustain these efforts.
Thank you. Next question. I see a hand over here.
Sorry. so far. When thinking about equity or reconciliation, how does the City of Toronto establish how much funding to put towards certain marginalized groups compared to other groups? Like, is it hard to specifically distinguish which groups need more, since some have deep past ancestral trauma, such as Indigenous groups, while others are currently facing difficulty now, such as people with disabilities or people of low income? So how does the city establish how much budget goes to each community in a fair way?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to just give a little overview of the reconciliation component that the Indigenous Affairs Office looks at when questions like that come up. So within our lens, we try and look at what the City of Toronto's policies and programs are currently, and were those detrimental to Indigenous communities when they were imposed. So to give you an example, Truth and Reconciliation and the calls to action allows for Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, to put their First Nations name or Indigenous spiritual name on their birth certificate because it was imposed that they was removed. They came in, said you'll no longer be called that. Example, my last name is Hill. They just came in and gave large families British last names or surnames. So my traditional name is not on my birth certificate. Now they'll allow it, and they'll also pay for it. So in a sense, what they're looking at as reconciliation aspect is what did they do to Indigenous people, and how can we correct that? From the equity standpoint, I believe my friend Mr. Kim here will answer that.
I just like Sam's answer, so we could end it there. But your question is a deep one, and it's a bit challenging for me to answer. So let me start with that. If there are other city staff who come before you to talk more formally about budgeting process, it's an excellent question to ask of them. In the city, often we talk about neighborhoods, but people with differing identities aren't isolated into one area of the city or one pocket of the city. And so necessarily we have to think equity as being geographically spread across. And so it doesn't seem to make sense to try and better fund a particular area over another. There are city divisions who deliver services and who might notice certain things. They might notice an underserved community, or they might, for example, if you're a rec center and you have community coming in saying, we desperately need this, we need this, we need this, then they're in a position to put that forward as part of their division's proposal. So after a while, sometimes though, things just naturally take hold. So the city does have a capital plan to improve accessibility in all city facilities. Right? So as new city facilities, whether they be rec centers, new civic buildings, garages, whatever the case might be, accessibility design guidelines are applied. The city opts to use the Toronto Accessibility Design Guidelines, which have more stringent design requirements than the Ontario Building Code. But that's the way the city wants to demonstrate and ensure that the accessibility of these buildings, which have 10, 25, 50-year lifespans, are being built to avoid fixing them later. So your question, I think there isn't a single answer. I think there's going to be multiple answers. I think divisions know their business the best, and where they see inequities, they'll put in for a budget case for that. But I think where the city adopts a formal strategy like the Accessibility Action Plan, the Multi-Year Accessibility Action Plan, and there are commitments made, then there is a broader effort in terms of how to adjust the way the city does what it does.
Our next question is actually from one of our virtual participants, so I will read the question. As prospective designers of our environment, even if we have the ideal data and can produce beautiful solutions guaranteed to enrich our lives, we run into the same problem: budget and provincial legislation, especially zoning. What do we need to do to regain agency of our ability to self-determine locally?
That's a tough one. I think there's some nuance in there. I think there's some unstated things in there, but I'm going to do my best to answer. The boring part of that answer is, as creatures of the province, the City of Toronto doesn't have additional extra authorities beyond those provisions of the Planning Act and the Building Code. But where there is flexibility in the Planning Act to exceed zoning requirements in exchange for public goods, city planning staff do an excellent job to do that, to try and ensure that as many public amenities and city priorities are included into the design of public infrastructure projects. If the question was more geared at, how can the city unlock some of its assets and cut red tape? That's a more interesting question, but sometimes it falls on community to drive a lot of that conversation too. So let me circle back to the Spirit Garden. The Spirit Garden is something that was first proposed by Council Fire, as Sam mentioned, and there are some interesting stories there. Nathan Phillips Square, for people who've been around the city for a long time, there was nothing done. There wasn't any public infrastructure built there. There was the reflecting pond. There was a big vacant square that serves as a wonderful canvas for farmers markets and seasonal activities. But in terms of otherwise redesigning a very hard-scaped area, there hadn't been much done. And so the fact that community could open up a conversation and drive this public commemoration monument building activity is significant. And it's a good reminder that sometimes in large bureaucratic organizations, the status quo, there's a heavy, heavy weight on the status quo. And so for change to happen, it requires really dedicated people with energy who know how to move and have those conversations and not give up so easily. I don't think that answers the question, but the short answer is the city is still obligated under provincial planning and building code regulations and laws.
Sam, do you want to add anything? Or
You know, I have to, sometimes the online questions are the hardest because if I could see the person, then I would know. The fact that they added in self-determination adds, I would think that they were Indigenous. You know, those are the hardest questions for an Indigenous office and anyone working in an Indigenous office to answer, whether you're in the municipal, provincial, or federal government, because there's an issue of land back, there's an issue of our inherent right to self-govern was taken away, and those, in my eyes, are not questions that even personally I can answer because I'm torn as well. So unfortunately I can't add to that, but I would, you know, if there was a little more to it, we expect nation to nation, and so coming from a low guy on the ladder in the Indigenous Affairs Office, I can't see myself answering that. Even as a Haudenosaunee person, that's my leadership, my clan mothers and my chiefs' duty to answer. So unfortunately, I really have to take a step back and say, I apologize, I can't.
thank you both for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to hand it over now to two University of Toronto students, Polina Gorn and Thea Reyes, to share some brief remarks and a thank you for today's session.
Hello, everyone. My name is Polina Gorn. I'm a student at the University of Toronto, and I would like to start the closing out of the session by thanking Professor Mehta for moderating such a thought-provoking discussion, by thanking all the students for your great question, and of course by thanking the presenters of the session for your insightful presentations. Sam and Mark, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge about your work and lived experiences and enhancing our understanding of how the City of Toronto works towards reconciliation and equity. Sam, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. It was fascinating to learn how you and your family have achieved excellence in the face of systemic barriers created by settler colonial national and municipal policies. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about the dish with one spoon and the two-row wampum, and for explaining how these treaties are relevant and applicable in the urban context of Toronto. Learning about the role of the Indigenous Affairs Office was enlightening. I appreciated your statement that the IO is not just a formal consultant or an extra layer of bureaucracy, but a municipal body that allows Indigenous peoples to express themselves, be visible in municipal government, and advocate for their rights and demands. The work that you and the Indigenous Affairs Office are doing makes me realize that Indigenous communities in Toronto will have a bright and equitable future, which is something we, as aspiring urban planners and civic activists, can contribute to. I will turn it over to my colleague Thea to finish up the closing out of today's session.
Thank you, Paulina. So hello, everyone. My name is Thea Reyes. I'm also a student at U of T. I would like to express my gratitude for today's talk on building an equitable city. As mentioned throughout the session, Toronto, with such a diverse population, demands such conversations and learnings to address the inequalities and inequities that persist in the city. We would like to thank you, Sam and Mark, for discussing how we can strive towards this vision. Thank you, Mark, for your talks on equity and reconciliation. Your meaningful work in the City Hall allows for a decrease in the amount of social injustice towards marginalized communities, promoting acceptance throughout our community. Understanding the individual lived experiences of each person in the city truly teaches us the value of acknowledging the positionality of people in shaping urban policies and planning decisions. Building on this, learning about the substantial work of the Equity Office and what you guys do allows for a deeper understanding of the operations and fiscal matters that go underway to enact meaningful change in addressing systemic inequalities. Your talk on collecting data and statistics that account for the diverse socioeconomic backgrounds was insightful. This work amplifies the voices of underrepresented communities, striving for more inclusive decision-making processes in the municipal government. Thank you, everyone, for coming here to City Hall. Thank you, professors, for providing us with this opportunity. And thank you again, Sam and Mark. We are looking forward to seeing the continued impact of your work as it builds a more equitable Toronto. This newfound knowledge we obtained through this session will allow us, as future urban planners and city builders, to continue to strive towards further visibility in this diversity.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, especially our speakers, for such a fantastic, insightful, thought-provoking session. I don't know if you have time afterwards, but I know there were a few more questions in the audience, so people might come and ask you if you have time. And we look forward to seeing all of you at our next session on November 1st, Community Planning, Affordable Housing and Homelessness. That one will be in Council Chamber. And lastly, if you are a U of T student, an OCAD student, a TMU student, or a York student, and do not have a partner yet for the collaborative reflection assignment, we will be having a meet and greet session in here right after class, so stick around so you can find a partner. Thanks again, everyone.